I'm Sarah Butcher, and this is the Side Comment. In this episode, Thomas Guglielmo argues that the U.S. military built not one color line during World War II, but a complex tangle of them.
So the title divisions refers to a few things, right? So first, it's of course a nod to the large storied Army outfits like, say, the 101st Airborne Division. But more important than that, it refers to one of the really big arguments of the book. So the book itself follows a portion of the 16 million young Americans that served in World War II as they moved from civilians to service members, as they were assigned to units, as they trained in those units, as they went overseas to fight. And divisions or color lines split some of these people from others in various configurations. And so that's really the main subject of the book, and that's what divisions most refers to. So for example, who served, who fought, who died in the war, who gave orders, and who was forced to follow them, who received the best ratings, who received the best jobs and pay and promotions, who was court-martialed, who received furloughs and leaves, who received honorable and dishonorable discharges. Color lines or racist divisions often spoke really definitively in all of these matters and more. And in doing so, these color lines shaped every imaginable aspect of military life. So the military's most important racist division split what the military called colored from white, or in today's terms, black from white. Now, this so-called colored category included anyone who was black or part black, but the all-important white category was really a moving target. At its most inclusive, it included everybody. It corralled everybody who was not black, creating what some scholars today call a black non-black line. And in these cases, the power of the black-white divide trumped and blurred other color lines. And in the process, it transformed folks like Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, and so forth. It transformed all of these folks into white insiders of a sort. And it should be noted that many of these folks, the military itself defined as non-white. And yet, because of the power of the black-white divide, there were times when these folks were transformed, as I said, into white insiders of a sort. And I'll give you one quick example. One 1940 War Department memo regarding who would join white military outfits held, and this is a quote, held that trainees of all races other than Negro will be assigned the same as white trainees, end of quote. So the point is that this black-white divide could corral all these folks who were typically defined as non-white, could corral them into this broader white category. But at the same time, note the language of that memo I just mentioned. Some of these, quote, races other than Negro were not exactly white, though they'd be assigned to outfits as if they were. So here you see, just in this memo, a sign that the military established additional racist divisions beyond this all-important black-white divide. And the most important of these other divides were various versions of a white, non-white line. And these white, non-white divisions were less widespread and often much less institutionalized than the black-white ones, but at times they nonetheless narrowed the category of who was white. At its most inclusive, this white, non-white line included in the white category only those folks who were of supposedly pure European descent. So what this meant in practice is that groups like Asian Americans, Latin Americans, and Native Americans zigged and zagged between whiteness, nominal whiteness, and non-whiteness, between insider, outsider, and some murky ground. Now, none of these groups, none of these what I call non-black minority groups moved more frequently or more dramatically than Japanese Americans. And this was because of their supposed ties to America's enemy in the Pacific. In fact, racist assumptions about those ties sometimes led to exclusions of Japanese Americans alone. So a kind of a form of a Japanese, non-Japanese line. And this boundary appears most obvious in the Navy's outright refusal to enlist any Japanese Americans at all throughout the war. So just to sum up then, I know this is complicated, but the military's complex of color lines constituted not simply a structure of white domination, though of course it was that. It was also a structure of Black subordination and often Japanese American and other non-white subordination as well. So resistance is every bit as important in this story as are divisions. So I've talked a lot about divisions, a lot about color lines, these kind of top-down efforts to divide service members. But as I say in the book, that's only half the story. The military's purpose in building these color lines, building these divisions, was often defensive. It sought to shore them up against Black people's and other people's constant efforts to rewrite these divisions or to remove them. What's more, to the extent that these boundaries shifted at all or blurred over the course of the war, these struggles, these bottom-up efforts to change these divisions, to erase them, deserve a good deal of credit. So that's a big part of the book, and yet we don't really understand the role of the military, and especially troops themselves, in civil rights histories. But I'd argue, and the book argues, that wide-ranging battles against the military's racist divisions are this vital chapter in the broader story of modern America's freedom movements. Now, so what were these movements exactly? So the first thing you need to know is that they were plural. There were many of them, not just one. Just as there were these distinct color lines that kind of snaked their way throughout the military, there were also these distinct movements that arose in response. So the most important of these movements involved Black troops and this wide array of allies, including Black newspapers, civil rights groups, labor unions, religious groups, troops, family members, and loved ones. The troops themselves tended in their activism tended to focus on racism, most common in their day-to-day lives in uniform. So the racism that involves, say, rank and promotions and their jobs and their recreation. And their allies supported them in these battles all along, but they also took the lead on some broader policy fights. For example, trying to gain equal access to the military and trying to desegregate the military in time. Black activists and their supporters employed this really impressive broad range of protest styles and tactics, including everything from letter writing, lobbying, voting, litigation, heroic soldiering, to boycotts, marches, strikes, sit-ins, armed self-defense. So this effort to democratize the military on the part of Black troops and their allies just employed the broadest range of styles and tactics to achieve their ends. Black soldiers tried their best as soldiers, hoping that heroic service in uniform might finally secure for them some semblance of fairness and decency and respect. And Black soldiers tried their least at times, convinced that no amount of sacrifice in uniform would uproot, ultimately, Jim Crow. Now, the upshot of these struggles, they overcame a bunch of opposition in the White House and in Congress, in the courts, in the military, so the kind of the highest echelons of white power in the US. And yet, despite this opposition, this movement scored some really important wartime victories nonetheless, which suggests its strength. To give you some examples of these victories, they helped to integrate some training camps, some military recreational spaces, and even in the final year of the war, some fighting units in Western Europe. But maybe more important than all of that, I would argue that this Black activism also forever transformed, forever changed conversations about military racism in the US. So, for example, the idea that the military should be integrated. This was a complete fringe position at the start of the war, but the support for integrated military outfits became a thoroughly mainstream position, at least in progressive circles, in a few short years. So this change in thinking about integration and the integrated military was critical, was kind of laid the foundation for President Truman's desegregation of the US military in the immediate post-war years. I would argue that that move by Truman, he's kind of celebrated as the kind of single author of the desegregation of the military, but it's not possible Truman's move is not possible without all this wartime Black activism. It really set the stage and made Truman's move possible. The book is all about divisions and the resistance against these divisions, the kind of what I call the call and response of those two things. And the upshot, the consequence of this kind of dance between racism and resistance throughout the wartime military, the consequence of this dance, of this call and response was really, really complicated. And I don't think we fully understand the complexity as of yet, but hopefully this book will kind of spell it out. So let me just mention some of this complexity. On the one hand, color lines and battles against color lines during the war convinced a growing number of American veterans when they got back home to democratize the nation. And in this process, these returning veterans were kind of newly emboldened to democratize America. And when they returned home, they invigorated a range of existing civil rights struggles and laid the foundation for really important civil rights gains to come in the post-war years, beginning with the desegregation of the military itself. So there were all kinds of ways in which the racism and resistance of the wartime military generated activism on the ground in the post-war years that democratized America, that made America a better place. So that's on the one hand, and that's a story I think we're fairly familiar with. It kind of is consistent with kind of good war narratives about the war as being this kind of effort at liberation. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the military's color lines also undermined these efforts to build a more egalitarian nation. So they traumatized, killed an unknowable number of non-white troops. These color lines further naturalized the very concept of race. That is, they made the very concept of race that much more commonsensical to people. These color lines deepened many whites' investments in white supremacy, especially anti-Black racism. And these color lines, as I mentioned before, further fractured the American people and their politics. Now, we don't know as much about these stories. They don't fit as well into the dominant narratives about the good war and the greatest generation, but they are really, really an essential, if disturbing, legacy of our World War II military. And let me just end here by saying that lost in this fracturing, lost in this divided military, was a simple but profound truth, and that is that military racism spared no one to varying degrees, and the book lays this out in excruciating detail. To varying degrees, African Americans, Japanese Americans, and other non-whites suffered immensely during World War II, and their harms lasted deep into the post-war years. But white people also paid a price, sometimes the ultimate price, for military racism. So, for example, racist barriers in enlistment and elsewhere ensured whites' overrepresentation among those who served in World War II, fought on the front lines, and died. And so, viewed in this way, as I say in the book at the very end, military racism crowned few true victors. And that's the way it's been with all forms of racism, past and present.